The Beatles are probably the most famous band of all time. Their material has spanned generations of people and worldwide acclaim all over, and most of their material they ever recorded as a group together has been released to the public. This even includes session tapes, outtakes, and different takes of songs that have finally been released to the public. But what if I'll tell you that not everything they ever recorded has been released? What there was actually a completed Beatles track that actually has never even surfaced to this day? Here I'm talking about the lost and canceled Beatles song, Carnival of Light. In this video, I kind of want to give you a little bit of history behind it, what it was, what it contained, and why it was canceled and my overall thoughts on it. So, to give you a little background first on it, it's kind of late 1966, and Paul McCartney is in London, and he's kind of getting into the psychedelic art scene that was kind of happening during that time period. He kind of collaborated with a few individuals, one of them named Vaughn, and Vaughn actually made him a psychedelically painted piano. I don't know if he used one of these in one of the videos Paul did, but after kind of receiving this piano, Paul McCartney kind of talked with this individual, Vaughn, and Vaughn and a few other collaborators he was working with that wanted to set up a art piece, so to speak. He wanted to set up a sort of electric, musical, visual rave that was supposed to happen at the Roundhouse in early 1967. And he asked Paul McCartney if maybe he would contribute some music to it. Now, this, of course, the rave was actually going to be called the Molten Volt Light and Sound Rave. And Paul actually agreed to Vaughn's request. So, at this point, we skip a little time after. Paul and the Beatles are kind of recording and preparing for their tracks that would eventually end up being on Mystery Tour and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Apparently, on the 5th of January, 1967, Paul went into the studio, kind of set up some microphones and some instruments. He had just got done overdubbing on the song Penny Lane, and he was kind of waiting on the band members to come into the studio. When they did arrive, Paul kind of asked them, just for like fun, right, to sort of come together, play instruments, say whatever came to their mind, and play whatever they thought musically in a kind of a avant-garde, very experimental, wild madness of music, right? And the band members all agreed to this and kind of described it, Paul kind of described it later on as kind of like a musical freakout, similar to like Frank Zappa's album that just released in 1966. And the band members all kind of played wildly different sounds. Now, this song would end up being roughly 13 to 14 minutes, and it was later described by a Beatles historian, and it was kind of composed in 4 tracks. The first track would be kind of distorted, hypnotic drum and organ sounds. Track 2 would be a distorted lead guitar. Track 3 would be like sounds of a church organ and various effects, like water gurgling and voices. And the weirdest part of this track was apparently John Lennon and Paul McCartney were going to be screaming wildly, just saying random phrases like, "Are you all right?" and "Barcelona." And then the 4th track would have been just various indescribable sound effects with tons of echo and manic tambourine and other things. And apparently at the end of the song, Paul in kind of an echo sound soaked voice, so to speak, would just say, "Can we hear it back now?" Which I'm assuming he was talking to the engineer. There was also a bit of the track as well that would lead into a sort of like tune that Paul was working on that would eventually become Fixing a Hole on Sgt. Pepper's. So that was kind of what this track was composed. The band was kind of like experimenting, kind of like just playing freely, saying whatever they thought came to their head, playing whatever sounds and whatever things that came to their head in terms of their instruments as well. So the track was recorded. It was kind of put into a rough mix, and tons of echo and other things were kind of put onto it as well, and overdubbing. And eventually, Paul kind of gave the track to Vaughn, and it was actually premiered for the first time at the rave on the 28th of January in 1967. Now, this rave was kind of described as like a big art piece, so to speak. People would kind of show up, and it was surrounded by like all these film projectors, and they would be screening footage of like tons of psychedelic looking images, and tons of lights were going to be involved. It was like a real thing. And the music was kind of supposed to represent that feeling. Now, Paul McCartney and the Beatles' Carnival of Light, which that was basically the name of the song that was given by the Beatles for this track, or Paul specifically, was played at this event. And people who were there at that event described it as kind of underwhelming, so to speak. It's kind of full of madness. People kind of described that there was no coherency to what was on the tape, right? Paul didn't actually even attend the show on 28th of January 1967. He was actually with George Harrison and himself at like a different concert that was like down the street or something. So, like I said, he wasn't even at the event. He was kind of mad with some of the organizers because apparently the version that was kind of given to the organizers who played the track included, like I said, a preview of Fixing a Hole, kind of the song that would eventually end up on Sgt. Pepper's, and Paul was kind of mad that little snippet of the song was put in. That being said, most people just kind of were very underwhelmed by it. Like I said, people just didn't think it was that crazy. Apparently Dave Allen of the Soft Machine Band, he recalled years later in a quote, "I dimly remember the sound collage because it was not particularly memorable. He had obviously improved a bit by the time Sgt. Pepper was made." So, like I said, people there were kind of like, this is kind of a big avant-garde piece of music, but nothing too memorable or striking, right? Now, what's strange is the event, on the 4th of February, this rave would also have a second night, and this time around, Paul and the Beatles band, the Carnival of Light song, was not played there. Instead, Jimi Hendrix and I think another band called the Echo Machine play their music instead. And that was kind of the end of it. For whatever reason, Carnival of Light actually never made it to any kind of official release. The band never released it officially. It never had a bootleg. No one recorded, a version of it at the show. So it was kind of just weird and mysterious and kind of lost for a while. And that was kind of, like I said, there was no bootleg of it, and kind of just lingered throughout the years as kind of the legend of Carnival of Light, this lost Beatles song, kind of grew in the public. Eventually, like I said, some people over the years, only a select few individuals have been able to hear the song, which is why we have a lot of information on what it actually was, right? For example, the legacy of this song is a bit interesting. For one, bits of this song, like some of the phrases that John was kind of shouting in the song, would eventually be used in Revolution 9, which was eventually released on the White Album. That song also being a very experimental, avant-garde piece of music that I think took a few months to record. So it's fascinating that bits of this song were eventually put into that song. And like I said, it seemed like too, the bit of like the avant-garde style of music was definitely kind of influencing the Beatles around this time period. It's definitely pretty interesting. Now, in the 1988 book, which McCarthy kind of likened the track, so to speak, as his way of like getting into like more experimental stuff. He worked with like a writer, so to speak, to kind of a band, like basically the writer was basically going to write about all the Beatles sessions and music they ever did. And Paul kind of showed him the version of Carnival of Light, which he actually had the master recordings. And this is where we get the more description of it and the more of like detail what this was. And he kind of was, like I said, like a lot of people kind of underwhelmed. There was a bunch of noise, a bunch of just random effects, a bunch of echo, a bunch of shouting, nothing too crazy, right? And, eventually later on in the years when in the mid-90s, after, Lennon passed away and stuff, the Beatles were actually trying to release Anthology 2, which was their kind of Beatles compilation album, where they were releasing tons of stuff, like tons of outtakes, tons of session tapes, tons of just extra material from the band over the years. And Paul, who already had the master tapes for their lost Beatles song Carnival of Light, wanted to include the song on Anthology too. He kind of reasoned that they were kind of putting everything on that album, right? So why not put this piece of weird avant-garde music they kind of just collaborated on in the mid 60s? And believe it or not, Harrison, who was also collaborating on this Anthology album, actually shot that down. He just wasn't a huge fan of avant-garde music, apparently, making the joke, avant-garde a clue when describing that type of music, and just felt like he didn't really want to include it on the compilation album. And Ringo also kind of shared his sentiments, and the track was left off the Anthology 2 album. And that was kind of like I said, it seemed like while we know for sure that the track wasn't lost, as Paul has said he still has the master tapes, just for whatever reason it's been struggling to get a release, right? For whatever reason, the parties involved have not been able to come together to actually sit down and release it. More talk about releasing this lost Beatles song was like happening in the 2000s at one point. He mentioned like I think the early 2001 or 2002, Paul was kind of putting together kind of a photo collage film for the Beatles, and he wanted the soundtrack of this little film that he was working on to be the Carnival Light music. But nothing ever happened of this little collage film that he was working on. It seemed like that was also scrapped. And then, like I said before, Paul would later repeat in interviews in like 2004 that like he still had the master tapes of the song, and he still kind of wants it to be released because he feels like the song represents the Beatles being free, right? Kind of his quotes, it's the Beatles free going off piste, right? And also he kind of, viewed the track as like a way where it's like Paul was getting into avant-garde music before John really got into it, right? Later on with Revolution 9 and other songs, and probably the more infamously Two Virgins album that he released solo-wise. And, for a while it seemed like this song was not going to make it. Like I said, Paul said he had it. He wanted to release it, but just for whatever reason, it seemed like the estates couldn't get it, couldn't come together, even after Harrison passed away, to get this song released. And then eventually, in 2017, in the lead up to like the 50th anniversary reissue and re-release of Sgt. Pepper's by the Beatles, where there was going to be tons of extra material included from that album on that reissue. There was tons of speculation that maybe Carnival of Light would be on this reissue of the album. Even more, Paul McCartney was kind of toying with the idea of maybe including this previously unreleased song in the mix, so to speak. But eventually, when the reissue came out in 2017, the Carnival of Light song was nowhere to be found. Apparently, one of the people who kind of oversaw, I think his name is Giles Martin, who kind of oversaw the stereo remix of the album, he would kind of later state that he heard the song and stuff, but he felt like Carnival of Light wasn't really a part of Sgt. Pepper's, right? It wasn't really recorded. It was like right before they started recording Sgt. Pepper's and the sessions for that album really began. So he felt like it wasn't really part of that whole album experience and just left it off the track list. And that was kind of, like I said, the end of it. He did express hope that maybe something interesting could be done with the track later on, but as of the time I'm recording this video, there's been nothing in terms of Carnival Light getting its own release, even after the long-awaited Beatles song Now and Then finally getting a release in 2023. Also want to kind of mention some other things that people have said about the song over the years, specifically George Martin, who kind of also helped evaluate a lot of the Beatles recordings that would also end up on the anthology. Kind of like I said, like he kind of mentioned it as like a song. He kind of mentioned the song as like a throwaway. He kind of mentioned it like it was kind of unnecessary, and that the band should really do something more creative with their time. And like I said, a lot of people, it just kind of is an interesting like dilution of like what people were saying about it. Like a lot of people were saying it was like a very, very experimental collage of sounds and echo. And tons of people just felt like it was very underwhelmed. Some people felt it was very experimental and out there. Regardless, a very unique and strange track for the Beatles that they ever recorded. Now, That is at the time of making this video, all the information in regards to the Carnival of Light, the Lost Beatles song. What is my overall opinion on it? I personally think, why not release it, right? I mean, it seems like one of the main reasons why this song, could not get a release is because for whatever reason the band members themselves felt like it just was unworthy of being released. Now, I do get it why it was not included like in the Sgt. Pepper's reissue, because I mean that this song was recorded, before that album sessions really kicked off. So like to me that totally makes sense, but why not include it in like the anthology? I mean, it's kind of a throwaway Beatles track they kind of recorded randomly for 13 to 14 minutes using crazy experimental techniques and musical instruments and tons of weird noises and stuff. Why not include it in the anthology? Like I said, it's not really meant to be like a extremely surreal and finished Beatles song. It's just kind of a fun bit of avant-garde experimental music. I mean, the band themselves are already legends, and I don't think a release of this song, would hurt anybody's feelings. So I don't know. Hopefully it gets released one day. Hopefully the estates can come together and release this lost Beatles song, Carnival of Light, one day. Even if it's kind of underwhelming, even if it's like not amazing, I figured it wouldn't hurt anybody for this like lost Beatles song to come out. I mean, if anything, it'll be a cool little experimental interlude into going into Sgt. Pepper, right? So yeah, I just want to give you my quick thoughts, a little bit of a breakdown of the history of Carnival of Light, the lost Beatles canceled song, and my overall thoughts on it. All right, y'all. Hope you have a good day. Peace. Goodbye.